Power and policy collide in Tallahassee, and the consequences could land in your mailbox, your school board, and your bank account. We're previewing the 2026 Florida legislative session, a high-stakes clash between the governor and lawmakers, a tightening state budget, sweeping property tax proposals, and fights over who can sue the government. We've brought in government law attorney Chris Hand to cut through the legal jargon and tell you what really matters and what you can do about it. Plus, an introduction today to a former state lawmaker running for attorney general. That's just ahead on This Week in Jacksonville. Now, Florida's attorney general plays a major role in consumer protection, public safety, and how the state handles big issues like affordability. With costs rising across Florida, including here in Northeast Florida, voters are going to be paying close attention to this race. I spoke recently with Jose Javier Rodriguez, a Democratic candidate for Florida attorney general.
Listen, Floridians need somebody in their corner. The job of the Attorney General is to be the people's lawyer. That's what I'm running to serve as. As Attorney General, I'm going to have three core priorities: tackling crime, costs, and corruption. Floridians deserve to have our state refocus on bread and butter public safety, particularly with our kids, and a number of issues that come out of the Attorney General's office. But I also talk about costs and corruption. The Attorney General's office, as Attorney General, I'll be focused on bringing relief in this affordability crisis. Insurance companies, utilities, they get whatever they want in Tallahassee. As Attorney General, that will stop. And I talk a lot about corruption as well. Having served in the state legislature, having fought battles for the little guy, for homeowners, workers, students, I know very well all the obstacles that there are in, frankly, state government for folks to get ahead, and addressing those, tackling those is a key priority. So I'm running to be the people's lawyer. Do you feel like some of those things you just addressed, you say, hey, these are my core issues, those haven't been addressed the way you'd like to see them addressed in this administration or the previous people who've served as Attorney General? Unfortunately not. I'll give you an example. I'm making my way around the state and I'm talking to people about how the Attorney General's office is going to bring relief. I just mentioned insurance, right? Investigate, bring actions, intervene. I was just up in Tallahassee with all these massive electric rate increases, battling those just as I had as a legislator. Attorney General is nowhere to be found. And when I talk to folks about these issues, sometimes people say, well, how is that the Attorney General's job? And the only reason why you ask that is because you've lived in Florida for decades, right? In many other states, state attorneys general are the ones bringing actions, standing up for their residents when they're getting screwed and when they're getting taken advantage of. And so my message is, as Attorney General, if you're dangerous, if you're screwing people, I don't care how powerful you are, I don't care how well connected you are, I don't care if you're from the same party as I am, you're gonna hear from me. So you talked about affordability and consumer protection. So spotlighting that affordability crisis in Florida, what can the Attorney General realistically do with that power as Attorney General to bring some relief to the families that you're talking about? Absolutely. So I served in the legislature. I'm also a 20-year litigator. My legal career has been, same as I was just saying, standing up for workers that have been taken advantage of, homeowners, right? My everyday law practice, I talk to truck drivers, I talk to everyday working people. That's who I'm fighting for. And in terms of what we're facing here in Florida, the Attorney General's office can do a lot to bring relief. I talked about insurance. I talked about battling, all these never-ending rate increases out of Tallahassee. In fact, one of the reasons why I didn't continue serving in the state Senate is because those same utilities targeted me. I was there was nobody else fighting them on behalf of their customers so much. They push back. They push back, yeah. But so another thing that I talk a lot about, about 20 years ago, I was the one, I was a little legal aid lawyer at that point. I was the one who led the effort to persuade the then Attorney General that they had the authority and responsibility to enforce the state minimum wage. 8 years ago, I was the one who led the effort to hold the then Attorney General accountable when they weren't doing enough about pill mills, right? And so my whole career has been getting in there and fighting for everyday people, and I look forward to doing that. if I'm the next Attorney General with the voters' help.
So, Senator, Northeast Florida's got some of the fastest growth in the state. With that growth, though, comes infrastructure strain, rising rents, pressure on small businesses. How does your platform maybe address some of those unique challenges, certainly we're facing in this region?
Absolutely. So when it comes to out-of-state investors, corporate landlords, this is one of those regions being, impacted, and renters being squeezed in particular, and the housing market getting squeezed by some practices that shouldn't be going on. State attorneys general have been stepping into the breach, not here. As Attorney General, again, my job is going to be to bring relief to Floridians from crime, costs, and corruption. And when it comes to the costs and corruption that are artificially inflating rent and impacting our housing costs, that's a place where the Attorney General's office will be very active as Attorney General.
I'm curious about this. I know you kind of referenced this a moment ago in our conversation, but the Attorney General sometimes going to need to push back on leaders, even in your own party. How do you assure voters that you'd be an independent watchdog, not a partisan actor?
That's easy. That has been the way that I served in the legislature. That's been, the way that I have worked. When, I represent workers, I don't ask them what their party affiliation is. Sometimes I know, and it's not the same one as mine, but it doesn't matter. The same thing when I was in the legislature, when I was advocating for students who got taken advantage of by a for-profit college. Didn't ask them their party affiliation. It
shouldn't matter, right? The law should be the determining factor, not how you trend right or left or in between.
100%. That's exactly right. And I think, and it's particularly important with the Attorney General's role. It's supposed to be an independent role. It's supposed to be serving the people. That is how I will approach the job. And so, again, for example, a big thing that will be a focus, I talk about crime and about recentering public safety. There's a lot of threats to our kids, evolving threats with technology, the opioid crisis, right? Nobody's going to be asking them their party affiliation, victims of crime. And so that is the job, and it is especially important with the Attorney General's job.
Yeah, election's coming up in this next year. Let's wrap up here. If you're elected in 2026, what's the biggest change Floridians would notice after 4 years with you as Attorney General?
Frankly, it'll be a relief. There's way too much political theater coming out of the Attorney General's office, especially now. There's a lot of stuff that they do. They have these press conferences. They go out and they pick on people just to try to get attention in Washington. So relief from that front, but more importantly, the issues that I'm talking about, crime, costs, and corruption, really refocusing on what the Attorney General's office can do to make your life better. That's what Floridians can expect.
Republican James Uthmeier is the current Attorney General. He's appointed this year by Governor Ron DeSantis, and he's running for a full term. Stephen Leskovich is the other Republican running so far. All right, coming up, our 2026 legislative session preview. Who's likely to win the fight between the governor and the legislature? Where could budget shortfalls hit your community? And how would proposed property tax changes affect schools and homeowners? We're breaking down the legal stakes, and we'll give you the one thing to do this December to be heard. That's ahead on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And government law attorney Chris Hand joining us now for a preview of Florida's 60-day legislative session that begins January 13th. One of the things, Chris, that we've kind of been watching, it seems like there's this battle that's going to go on between the Republican governor and the Republican-led legislature. We're seeing some tension there between Governor DeSantis.
Kent, this is a tale as old as time when it comes to the Florida legislature. When a governor in his last year faces his last legislative session, by that point, much of his kind of political capital is utilized at that point. And the legislature really has, over the last couple of years, began to sort of reassert its institutional autonomy and independence, kind of showing that it's a co-equal branch of government. And so the governor has a very ambitious agenda in 2026. He wants to have a mid-cycle redistricting. He wants to eliminate property taxes on homestead property. He wants to regulate artificial intelligence. There's a number of things that are big ticket items he wants to do. That's going to be increasingly hard to get through a legislature that, particularly on the House side, has been more adverse to his interests than we've seen in previous years.
Either side here, whatever, what levers does each side, I guess, have realistically to be able to advance or block the other's priorities during this 60-day session that starts in January?
Well, in terms of kind of the governor's priorities, of course, he will, not only has he articulated what those priorities are, but he'll also present a budget on January the 13th to the legislature. So they'll also be spending a good chunk of the session looking at revising and ultimately passing a revised budget. You know, none of his priorities are possible unless he gets a majority of support in both houses of the legislature. So that's obviously leverage that the legislators have, is their votes are the key to deciding whether his agenda passes or not. In his case, particularly over the budget, but on other bills as well, the governor has veto authority and can veto either line items in the budget or particular pieces of legislation. Now, unlike the earlier part of his term, this legislature has shown a willingness to come back and try and override some of those vetoes when they happen. So we have a 60-day session that starts on January 13th and is scheduled, emphasis on scheduled, to end in mid-March. I think we're going to see some special sessions. We're going to see things go long because this is Governor DeSantis' last shot. This is his last chance to pass anything through the legislature, but the legislature also wants to assert its priorities over his.
Well, you talked about budgeting being one of the things. I mean, we've got warnings about tighter revenue, legal constraints, procedural options. All of that's going to shape this budget for 2026. I guess if revenues do fall short, then what kind of steps can lawmakers take on this budget to try and make sure that things are balanced?
Well, they're not going to fall short this year. Kent, the process is each fall, state economists get together and do a report for what's called the Legislative Budget Commission to make projections about what state revenue is going to look like versus state expenses. They are projecting for this particular year that Florida will still have a budget surplus somewhere in the realm of about $4 billion. But they are also saying that in future years, next year a deficit of about $1.5 billion, and the year after that a deficit of almost $7 billion. I think what that's likely to mean is that legislators will look for some ways to slow the rate of spending this year in hopes of trying to avert the deficit next year and maybe begin to make some progress on the year after that as well. In fact, the House Budget Chief, who's part of this Legislative Budget Commission, said exactly that they're going to look for ways to try and deal with spending. You know, there's the old message about Willie Sutton was asked why he robbed banks, and he said, that's where the money is. Well, if you want to know where the legislature might slow spending, you look in the budget to see where the money is. A lot of the budget is dedicated to education. A lot of it is dedicated to health care. So those are areas where you might look to see some legislative spending controls this year to try and deal with budget deficits in the next 2 years.
And those two areas you just mentioned are a couple areas where people say, no, don't pull back on them. Let's talk about these property tax proposals. Legislature is advancing some major property tax changes. The governor says that's a priority, but they're not aligned. And where does the money come from that usually is taken from property tax to provide some critical services throughout the state?
Well, they're not aligned might be the understatement of the session, and in fact, they're barely speaking at this point. But essentially where we are is, you know, Governor DeSantis started about a year ago talking about his desire to eliminate the property tax in Florida. He has since modified that to say he at least wants to eliminate the property tax on homestead property, homes that people own and kind of use as their primary residence. The legislature, initially the State House was a little more in favor of cutting the sales tax. They've now advanced a series of proposals to potentially reduce the property tax along the lines of kind of, again, getting rid of it on homestead property in the state. So again, there's some conceptual alignment in terms of what people say they want to achieve, but after that, in terms of how they would achieve it, what constitutional amendment they might put on the ballot, the exact process, there is not alignment, and it's not clear when or if there will be in the legislative session. But one group that's particularly not aligned with that goal, Kent, is city and county governments around the state, because where the property tax has the biggest impact is on local government. It is primarily how cities and counties fund their operations, fund core services like police, fire, public works and parks. It's also how school districts fund themselves as well, primarily through property tax. Just to put this in some perspective, Kent, here in Jacksonville, the city of Jacksonville right now has about a $2 billion annual budget. $1.2 billion of that is supported by property taxes. If you were just to eliminate the property tax on homestead property, that would eliminate $400 million, or 1/5, 20% of the city of Jacksonville budget. That would obviously have devastating consequences for those core services we're talking about, unless revenue can be raised through some other way. So there's going to be a lot of debate over, number one, is a property tax worth the potential trade-offs in local services and local revenues? And if so, if the legislature wants to put it on the ballot, what form does that amendment or amendments look like?
Yeah, lots to sort out, even now before we get to January and the session. So stay with us and don't miss our final segment, because during this next few minutes, we're going to examine local bills that quietly reshape communities and that looming mid-cycle redistricting fight that could change election maps before the next vote. If your neighborhood, your city, your ballot's on the line, this is the part you need to hear. Stay with us.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Chris Hand is with us, our Hand on Government issue. And we're kind of previewing the legislative session, and there's a lot to talk about. One of those things you referenced a moment ago, mid-cycle redistricting. This is a fight that we're seeing in other states, certainly something that is affecting Florida as well.
Well, Florida is probably going to be the next state in the national eye on this issue, Ken. As you know, President Trump called for Texas to redistrict in the middle of the cycle to create more Republican seats. Texas did that and created 5 new ones. California then responded and passed a constitutional amendment that created 5 new Democratic seats there. So that we've seen this back and forth around the country. Florida may well be the next location for that. Governor DeSantis has talked about redrawing the seats in the state. This coming week, the Florida legislature, the House Redistricting Committee, is going to have its first meeting to talk about this possibility. What's so unusual about this mid-cycle redistricting we're seeing not just in Florida but other places is it's not typically how the process works. Under the Constitution, we have a census once every 10 years to gauge what the population is and then apportion congressional seats to different states, and then seats then draw those congressional seats kind of in accordance with the law. That typically happens, it happened here in Florida and other states in 2022, right after the last census. But we've increasingly seen these mid-cycle redistrictings where states are trying to kind of change the balance of the seats that are there so they can hopefully impact the makeup of Congress. This may well happen in Florida again in 2026.
Something certainly we're watching in Florida and those other states, because there are legal challenges to what's happened there. I want to talk about this and maybe some legal challenges here too. Where does Florida law stand on vaccine mandates and public health authority and that? Because we've seen that conversation change this year in Florida.
Well, back in September, Kent, the Florida Surgeon General announced that he and the governor supported him in saying we want to abolish any vaccine mandates for children in the state of Florida. When you look at the polling, Kent, not only do those kind of mandates, making sure that children are, vaccinated against a variety of communicable diseases before they get to, school age, to kind of help protect public health. That is something that the American Medical Association, the Florida Medical Association, a variety of medical experts strongly support having those vaccine requirements. It's also generally popular with the public. Both in national and state polling, more than 80% of those polled support those vaccine mandates to kind of, again, help protect public health and, most importantly, children's health in school. It's become somewhat controversial in that the Surgeon General and the governor have called to get rid of some of those mandates. Now, some of those they can get rid of just through their authority over the Florida Health Department, like the mandate for the flu vaccine or the chickenpox vaccine. But some mandates are a requirement of Florida law. Back in 1977, the legislature passed a law that required that children be vaccinated against diphtheria and pertussis and tetanus and a variety of other, again, very serious illnesses that can ultimately lead to death if they're not treated properly or prevented. There has been some suggestion by the governor and the Surgeon General that the legislature should abolish those vaccine mandates that have been in place since 1977. There is no sign yet that the legislature is planning to make that a priority item. We will continue to watch that. moving into December and moving actually into the January session. But obviously it's very controversial among medical professionals, among members of the public. No sign yet as to whether the legislature is going to take the recommendation of the governor and the Surgeon General of Florida.
I know before we went to commercial break, I kind of teed up. We were going to talk about some of the local bills. And I wanted to give you a chance to tell people, hey, if you want input on what's going to happen in the legislative session, just to talk about that. These local or special interest bills keep reappearing. What would you have to tell folks today?
Well, I mean, there are bills that go before different county legislative delegations that they ultimately advance to the legislature that could address a variety of issues involving local governments, how those governments operate. We've seen some in this cycle about how the school board is represented by attorneys that will advance to the legislature. But I think it's also a good reminder, Kent, again, of who's at the top of the organizational chart in this process.
Is it the governor?
No.
Is it the House?
It's
is it the
not.
Senate?
It's none of those things. It's the people. It's the citizens. And this is a particularly crucial time in this sort of 6 weeks before the session starts for citizens to engage with their legislators. Really tell your member of the House or your member of the Senate what your priorities are, how you want them to be spending their time in 2026, what items they should be prioritizing when they're putting together the budget. Or if there are particular bills that you support or oppose, make sure they know that. That's how this process is supposed to work. Providing that feedback now before legislators go to Tallahassee is often the most impactful.
This is one of the great things about having Chris with us, because you're consistent in that message. Exercise those rights you have as a citizen and be part of this. I appreciate the time today. Thanks for being with us. And thank you for being with us. Republican candidate for Governor James Fishback plans to join us in studio next time. Very controversial start to his campaign. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching today.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.